Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, from Recall This Book, welcome to a new feature that sends us plunging back through time to resurrect the short fiction of the past with the writers of today. The series, Recall This Story, premiered back in the spring with my wonderful Brandeis creative writing colleague Steve McCauley reading aloud John Cheever's The 548. And now, hopping from strength to strength, we have the novelist Linda Schlossberg with us. Because today's story is long and meaty, we've decided to break this episode into two parts. After you listen to Linda read our chosen story's first half and unpack its secrets for us, you can head back to your feed and download part 2 to hear the thrilling conclusion and our further reflections on what makes the story work and stick in our memories. Linda, I hope you accept the label The Novelist, which is based on your marvelous 2010 Life in Miniature, though we might also say lots of other things. For example, the prize-winning professor, since you're famous for classes like Harlots, Dandies, Blue Stockings, which you teach in Women, Gender, and Sexuality department at Harvard. Or we might just say generally fiction writer, since your work has been recognized by the Somerville Arts Council, the Mass Cultural Council, the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, the Doris Bacon Awards, the National League of American Pen Women. Oh my God, I'm getting tired just reading this list. The Writers League of Texas, the Tucson Festival of Books, and Writers at Work. And your shorter fiction has appeared in places like McSweeney's, Post Road, Conduit, the Belladonna, and the San Francisco Chronicle. But Linda, could we also say John's old friend is another category of who you are, since to me, you will always be that brilliant fellow graduate student I met in classes on Victorian literature way back in the first year of grad school when you were fresh out of Brandeis, another good Brandeis connection, with the leather jacket and the incisive political analysis to prove it. So Linda, welcome. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you, John. And I definitely accept the category of John's old friend.
Okay, good. FOJ.
Okay.
Linda, I offered you this assignment, which is, I said, could you pick a story to read and to also offer a reading of? And you landed very quickly on the Canadian short storyist Alice Munro. I should say short storyist because that is really who she is, who won the Nobel Prize in 2013 and who passed away this May at the age of 92. So Linda, pretty broad opening question. Why did you pick this story?
Thanks for asking, John. And thank you again for having me on this podcast. Well, I love Alice Munro. I mean, she is very much, as people say, a writer's writer. Of course, I only had 150 stories to choose from. She was so prolific. It's like asking someone, to choose an Emily Dickinson poem, right? How do you land on the one that you want to talk about today?
I know, a short story collection every 4 years throughout her adult life. I can't imagine.
It is mind-boggling. It really, really is. And you think you know who Alice Munro is because you've read 25 of her stories, and then you read another 25, and she's a completely different author.
Yeah.
One of the things I will say about Munro is that she shows incredible generosity towards her characters, even the characters, as they so often are, who are incredibly flawed, who make mistakes, who act in ways that are against their self-interest. She is a writer who is very happy and willing to delve into other aspects of human character, in particular, the characters of girls and women, which is something that women writers are presumed not to do or asked not to do in various ways. And in so doing, she sort of opens up a wider scope of humanity for us. She's going to ask us to rethink what we desire in reading, right? What is it that we want to be entertained by in fiction? What we desire in fiction, of course, is very different from what we desire in life.
Yeah. So Linda, when you and I talked earlier, you said you didn't want to get too deep into like the history of the short story, but I knew that Edgar Allan Poe was going to come up, partly because Poe writes this philosophy of the short story back in the 1830s that some people say, oh, the short story is still guided by that, which is that, short stories have compression and singularity, and they really draw to a comprehensible point. And you're already saying ways in which Alice Munro doesn't deliver on that aspect of what the short story is supposed to do. But the other Poe connection I thought of is that Poe has this wonderful phrase, the imp of the perverse, meaning the things we do not because they'll get us what we want, but because we know they won't get us what we want, and we still do them. So you describe the characters as, you know, the characters that Munro represents as showcasing that kind of perversity, in the sense that they go off what they themselves think of as the productive track. But you also said that about us as readers. Like as readers, we get a little bit, you know, switched back, you know, and there's a bit of perversity in reading Munro too, because we don't get the pleasure that we thought we were in it for.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a line right at the beginning of this story that I'll just read to you now, just as a little preview. It was understood
Yeah,
that they might find something horrible, right? And that could be
yeah,
true of any number of Alice Munro stories.
yeah,
I mean, Munro is not for the faint of heart. You can expect that horrible things will happen. People will betray one another. People will say ugly things. Terrible tragedies may occur. And the story, in some way, I think at the end sort of almost addresses the reader, asking us what it is that we anticipate and desire from an Alice Munro story.
yeah. We should sort of look out for when the word trashy comes up, because it turns
Absolutely.
out we get implicated in its trashiness. So maybe this is a good time for me to just give the kind of penny life version of the Alice Munro, you know, the sort of overview of Alice Munro for folks who are coming without knowing too much about her, because you're in for a huge treat. I will say that she was born in 1931 as Alice Laidlaw in Wingham, Ontario. Her mother was a school teacher. Her father was a fox and a mink, and this proves to be interesting. Also, he became a turkey farmer later in life. And also, she's a descendant of another great writer of short fiction, James Hogg, which, you know, who I could talk about till the cows come home or till the hogs come home. Um, she began writing as a teenager. She published her first story, which is called The Dimensions of a Shadow, in 1950, while she was studying English and journalism at the University of Western Ontario. She then moved out west to West Vancouver and then to Victoria, and she and her husband together opened a bookstore called Munro's Books, still around. She received the Man Booker International Prize in 2009 for her body of work. She won the Canadian Governors General's Award for Fiction 3 times, a bunch of other awards, and then she actually mostly stopped writing around 2013, which interestingly is around the time she received the Nobel Prize for Literature. It was the first ever Canadian Nobel Prize for Literature. Her first collection of stories, Dance of the Happy Shades, 1968, then Lives of Girls and Women, which we could talk about later, Linda, maybe because it's the closest she comes to a novel. It's a set of interlocking stories, but often her stories are like interlocked with one another, although she never publishes a novel. And then, as I said, a short story collection at least once every 4 years, including the collection that this story appeared in, which is in 1986, The Progress of Love. Anything else we should say about Munro up front, Linda? Or are you ready to just dive in?
I think we can just dive in.
Okay. So you're going to read Miles City, Montana, first appeared in the New Yorker in 1985.
My father came across the field, carrying the body of the boy who had been drowned. There were several men together, returning from the search, but he was the only one carrying the body. The men were muddy and exhausted and walked with their heads down, as if they were ashamed. Even the dogs were dispirited, dripping from the cold river. When they all set out, hours before, the dogs were nervy and yelping, the men tense and determined, and there was a constrained, unspeakable excitement about the whole scene. It was understood that they might find something horrible. The boy's name was Steve Golly. He was 8 years old. His hair and clothes were mud-colored now and carried some bits of dead leaves, twigs, and grass. He was like a heap of refuse that had been left out all winter. His face was turned into my father's chest, but I could see a nostril, an ear plugged up with greenish mud. I don't think I really saw all this. Perhaps I saw my father carrying him and the other men coming with him and the dogs, but I would not have been allowed to get close enough to see something like mud in his nostril. I must have heard someone talking about that and imagined that I saw it. I see his face unaltered except for the mud. Steve Golly's familiar, sharp-honed, sneaky-looking face. And it wouldn't have been like that. It would have been bloated and changed and perhaps muddied all over after so many hours in the water. To have to bring back such news, such evidence to a waiting family, particularly a mother, would have made searchers move heavily. But what was happening here was worse. It seemed a worse shame to hear people talk that there was no mother, no woman at all, no grandmother or aunt, or even a sister to receive Steve Golly and give him his due of grief. His father was a hired man, a drinker but not a drunk, an erratic man without being entertaining, not friendly, but not exactly a troublemaker. His fatherhood seemed accidental, and the fact that the child had been left with him when the mother went away and that they continued living together seemed accidental. They lived in a steep-roofed, gray-shingled hillbilly sort of house that was just a bit better than a shack. The father fixed the roof and put supports under the porch, just enough and just in time. And their life was held together in a similar manner, that is, just well enough to keep the children's aid at bay. They didn't eat meals together or cook for each other, but there was food. Sometimes the father would give Steve money to buy food at the store, and Steve was seen to buy quite sensible things, such as pancake mix and macaroni dinner. I had known Steve Golly fairly well. I had not liked him more often than I had liked him. He was 2 years older than I was. He would hang around our place on Saturdays, scornful of whatever I was doing, but unable to leave me alone. I couldn't be on the swing without him wanting to try it, and if I wouldn't give it up, he came and pushed me so that I went crooked. He teased the dog. He got me into trouble, deliberately and maliciously, it seemed to me afterward, by daring me to do things I wouldn't have thought of on my own. Digging up the potatoes to see how big they were when they were still only the size of marbles, and pushing over the stacked firewood to make a pile we could jump off. At school, we never spoke to each other. He was solitary, though not tormented. But on Saturday mornings, when I saw his thin, self-possessed figure sliding through the cedar hedge, I knew I was in for something, and he would decide what. Sometimes it was all right. We pretended we were cowboys who had to tame wild horses. We played in the pasture by the river, not far from the place where Steve drowned. We were horses and riders both, screaming and neighing and bucking and waving whips of tree branches beside a little nameless river that flows into the Saugeen in southern Ontario. The funeral was held in our house. There was not enough room at Steve's father's place for the large crowd that was expected because of the circumstances. I have a memory of the crowded room, but no picture of Steve in his coffin, or of the minister, or of wreaths of flowers. I remember that I was holding one flower, a white narcissus, which must have come from a pot somebody forced indoors because it was too early for even the forsythia bush or the trilliums and marsh marigolds in the woods. I stood in a row of children, each of us holding a narcissus. We sang a children's hymn, which somebody played on our piano. When he cometh to make up his jewels. I was wearing white-ribbed stockings, which were disgustingly itchy and which wrinkled at the knees and ankles. The feeling of these stockings on my legs is mixed up with another feeling in my memory. It's hard to describe. It had to do with my parents. Adults in general, but my parents in particular. My father, who had carried Steve's body from the river, and my mother, who must have done most of the arranging of its funeral. My father in his dark blue suit, and my mother in her brown velvet dress with the creamy satin collar. They stood side by side, opening and closing their mouths for the hymn, and I stood removed from them in the row of children, watching. I felt a furious and sickening disgust. Children sometimes have an access of disgust concerning adults. The size, the lumpy shapes, the bloated power, the breath, the coarseness, the hairiness, the horrid secretions. But this was more. And the accompanying anger had nothing sharp and self-respecting about it. There was no release, as when I would finally bend and pick up a stone and throw it at Steve Golly. It could not be understood or expressed, though it died down after a while into a heaviness, then just a taste, an occasional taste, a thin, familiar misgiving. 20 years or so later, in 1961, my husband, Andrew, and I got a brand new car, our first. That is, our first brand new. It was a Morris Oxford, oyster colored. The dealer had some fancier name for the color. A big, small car with plenty of room for us and our two children. Cynthia was 6 and Meg 3.5. Andrew took a picture of me standing beside the car. I was wearing white pants, a black turtleneck, and sunglasses. I lounged against the car door, canting my hips to make myself look slim. Wonderful, Andrew said. Great, you look like Jackie Kennedy. All over this continent, probably, dark-haired, reasonably slender young women were told when they were stylishly dressed or getting their pictures taken that they looked like Jackie Kennedy. Andrew took a lot of pictures of me and of the children, our house, our garden, our excursions and possessions. He got copies made, labeled them carefully, and sent them back to his mother and his aunt and uncle in Ontario. He got copies for me to send to my father, who also lived in Ontario, and I did so, but less regularly than he sent his. When he saw pictures he thought I had already sent lying around the house, Andrew was perplexed and annoyed. He liked to have this record go forth. That summer, we were presenting ourselves, not pictures. We were driving back from Vancouver, where we lived, to Ontario, which we still called home, in our new car. 5 days to get there, 10 days there, 5 days back. For the first time, Andrew had 3 weeks holiday. He worked in the legal department at BC Hydro. On a Saturday morning, we loaded suitcases, 2 thermos bottles, one filled with coffee and one with lemonade, some fruit and sandwiches, picture books, coloring books, crayons, drawing pads, insect repellent, sweaters, in case it got cold in the mountains, and our 2 children into the car. Andrew locked the house, and Cynthia said ceremoniously, "Goodbye, house." Meg said, "Goodbye, house." Then she said, "Where will we live now?" "It's not goodbye forever," said Cynthia. "We're coming back. Mother, Meg thought we weren't ever coming back." "I did not," said Meg, kicking the back of my seat. Andrew and I put on our sunglasses and we drove away, over the Lionsgate Bridge and through the main part of Vancouver. We shed our house, the neighborhood, the city, and at the crossing point between Blaine, Washington, and British Columbia, our country. We were driving east across the United States, taking the most northerly route, and would cross into Canada again at Sarnia, Ontario. I don't know if we chose this route because the Trans-Canada Highway was not completely finished at the time, or if we just wanted the feeling of driving through a very slightly foreign country, that extra bit of interest and adventure. We were both in high spirits. Andrew congratulated the car several times. He said he felt so much better driving it than our old car, a 1951 Austin that slowed down dismally on the hills and had a fussy old lady image. So Andrew said now. "What kind of image does this one have?" said Cynthia. She listened to us carefully and liked to try out new words, such as image. Usually she got them right. "Lively," I said, "slightly sporty. It's not show-off." "It's sensible, but it has class," Andrew said, "like my image." Cynthia thought that over and said with conscious pride, "That means like you think you want to be, Daddy." As for me, I was happy because of the shedding. I loved taking off. In my own house, I seemed to be often looking for a place to hide, sometimes from the children, but more often from the jobs to be done, and the phone ringing, and the sociability of the neighborhood. I wanted to hide so that I could get busy at my real work, which was a sort of wooing of distant parts of myself. I lived in a state of siege, always losing just what I wanted to hold on to. But on trips, there was no difficulty. I could be talking to Andrew, talking to the children, and looking at whatever they wanted me to look at. A pig on a sign, a pony in a field, a Volkswagen on a revolving stand, and pouring lemonade into plastic cups. And all the time, those bits and pieces would be flying together beside me. The essential composition would be achieved. This made me hopeful and lighthearted. It was being a watcher that did it, a watcher, not a keeper. We turned east at Everest and climbed into the Cascades. I showed Cynthia our route on the map. First, I showed her the map of the whole United States, which showed also the bottom part of Canada. Then I turned to the separate maps of each of the states we were going to pass through: Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I showed her the dotted line across Lake Michigan, which was the route of the ferry we would take. Then we would drive across Michigan to the bridge that linked the US and Canada at Sarnia, Ontario, home. Meg wanted to see too. You won't understand, said Cynthia, but she took the road atlas into the back seat. Sit back, she said to Meg. Sit still. I'll show you. I could hear her tracing the route for Meg very accurately, just as I had done it for her. She looked up all the states' maps, knowing how to find them in alphabetical order. You know what that line is? She said. It's the road. That line is the road we're driving on. We're going right along this line. Meg did not say anything. Mother, show me where we are right this minute, said Cynthia. I took the atlas and pointed out the road through the mountains, and she took it back and showed it to Meg. See where the road's all wiggly, she said. It's wiggly because there are so many turns in it. The wiggles are the turns. She flipped some pages and waited a moment. Now, she said, show me where we are. Then she called to me, Mother, she understands. She pointed to it. Meg understands maps. It seems to me now that we invented characters for our children. We had them firmly set to play their parts. Cynthia was bright and diligent, sensitive, courteous, watchful. Sometimes we teased her for being too conscientious, too eager to be what we, in fact, depended on her to be. Any reproach or failure, any rebuff went terribly deep with her. She was fair-haired, fair-skinned, easily showing the effects of the sun, raw winds, pride, or humiliation. Meg was more solidly built, more reticent, not rebellious, but stubborn sometimes, mysterious. Her silences seemed to us to show her strength of character, and her negatives were taken as signs of an imperturbable independence. Her hair was brown, and we cut it in straight bangs. Her eyes were a light hazel, clear and dazzling. We were entirely pleased with these characters, enjoying the contradictions as well as the confirmations of them. We disliked the heady, the uninventive approach to being parents. I had a dread of turning into a certain kind of mother, the kind whose body sagged and ripened, who moved in a woolly-smelling, milky-smelling fog, solemn with trivial burdens. I believed that all the attention these mothers paid, their need to be burdened, was the cause of colic, bedwetting, asthma. I favored another approach, the mock desperation, the inflated irony of the professional mothers who wrote for magazines. In those magazines, pieces the children were splendidly self-willed, hard-edged, perverse, indomitable. So were the mothers, though through their wit, indomitable. The other mothers I warmed to were the sort who would phone up and say, hey, is my embryo Hitler by any chance over at your house? They cackled clear above the milky fog. We saw a dead deer strapped across the front of a pickup truck. Somebody shot it, Cynthia said. Hunters shoot the deer. It's not hunting season yet, Andrew said. They may have hit it on the road. See the sign for deer crossing? I would cry if we hit one, Cynthia said sternly. I had made peanut butter and marmalade sandwiches for the children and salmon and mayonnaise for us, but I had not put any lettuce in, and Andrew was disappointed. I didn't have any, I said. Well, couldn't you have gotten some? I'd have had to buy a whole head of lettuce just to get enough for sandwiches, and I decided it wasn't worth it. This was a lie. I had forgotten. They're a lot better with lettuce. I didn't think it made that much difference. After a silence, I said, don't be mad. I'm not mad. I like lettuce on sandwiches. I just didn't think it mattered that much. How would it be if I didn't bother to fill up the gas tank? That's not the same thing. Sing a song, said Cynthia. She started to sing. 5 little ducks went out one day, over the hills and far away. 1 little duck went quack, quack, quack. 4 little ducks came swimming back. Andrew squeezed my hand and said, "Let's not fight." "You're right," I said. "I should have gotten lettuce. It doesn't matter that much." I wished that I could get my feelings about Andrew to come together into serviceable and dependable feeling. I'd even tried writing 2 lists, one of things I liked about him, one of things I disliked. In the cauldron of intimate life, things I loved and things I hated, as if I hoped by this to prove something, to come to a conclusion one way or the other. But I gave it up when I saw that all it proved was what I already knew, that I had violent contradictions. Sometimes the very sound of his footsteps seemed to me tyrannical, the set of his mouth smug and mean, in his hard, straight body a barrier interposed, quite consciously, even dutifully, and with a nasty pleasure in its masculine authority, between me and whatever joy or lightness I could get in life. Then, with not much warning, he became my good friend and most essential companion. I felt the sweetness of his light bones and serious ideas, the vulnerability of his love, which I imagined to be much purer and more straightforward than my own. I could be greatly moved by an inflexibility, a harsh propriety, and at other times I scorned. I would think how humble he was, really, taking on such a ready-made role of husband, father, breadwinner, and how I myself, in comparison, was really a secret monster of egotism. Not so secret either, not from him. At the bottom of our fights, we served up what we thought were the ugliest truths. "I know there's something basically selfish and basically untrustworthy about you," Andrew once said. "I've always known it. I also know that that is why I fell in love with you." "Yes," I said, feeling sorrowful but complacent. "I know that I'd be better off without you." "Yes, you would. You'd be happier without me." "Yes." And finally, racked and purged, we clasped hands and laughed at these 2 benighted people, ourselves, their grudges, their grievances, their self-justification. We leapfrogged over them. We declared them liars. We would have wine for dinner or decide to give a party. I haven't seen Andrew for years. Don't know if he is still thin, has gone completely gray, insists on lettuce, tells the truth, or is hearty and disappointed.
So, Linda, I just want to say this is your idea to pause in the middle to discuss, and it's an innovation in Recall the Story, and I love it.
And it,
Partly
so
because I love this moment.
I love this moment too, but also I just want to say that we are breaking all the rules of short story reading, which is that you're supposed to read a short story all in one sitting, right? So we
Yes,
are already being
right.
rule breakers here in our conversation. But
Yeah,
I love this
totally.
moment too. It's an amazing example of um, one of Munro's best tactics, which is to flash forward in time. And this is an interesting contrast with the way that she, of course, flashes back in time right at the beginning of the story.
Right. And that's I'm glad you put it that way because of course when the story begins, we don't know that it is a flash backward in time. We just know that we're in the story of someone, this boy Steve, drowning when the narrator is young. And then we come to find out that the story itself is set at a moment when the narrator is, a young married and narrated from the time when she's already older and divorced
Right,
or separated or something, no longer with that same family.
right.
So there's 3 times at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting and so productive the way she's looping through these different moments, right? I mean, we start in the scene of this childhood recollection about a drowned boy, this boy who lives next door, who she has a kind of half friendship with, a tentative friendship with, and
Yeah.
sets the stage for us as readers, right? The kind of emotional tenor for the piece. And it also sets us up for a certain, as I said before, set of expectations for what we might find as we read this story.
So Linda, you mentioned that we're getting this story, but in a way we're also getting the story imperfectly. And I was noticing this throughout that, even the story of the present, we're not even really sure why they chose the road they did. She's looking back and not sure whether that was a conscious choice or just because of construction. And in the same way, in the early story, we don't know whether the story we're hearing is an accurate story. Like she's pretty sure it isn't actually, because she has this image of Steve's drowned face, but she knows for a fact that his face couldn't have been like that. She says, I see his face unaltered, except for the mud. And it wouldn't have been like that. It would have been bloated and changed and muddied. So, in other words, she's telling us there's a bloated and changed and muddied perspective on the story that she's telling. Even at the moment she's giving us the facts, she's also telling us she doesn't trust the facts.
Right. She is already questioning her memory here, and she's already questioning how she set up the story, as it were, for us. And one thing that we could think about when we think about this narrator is she is very much a figure for the author herself, right? This is not to say that this character is Munro, but she is the figure of a writer. And we hear about her saying that she is always looking for the hiding places in her own home so that she can pay more attention to her writing process. So,
Though the one thing we see her writing is that unsatisfactory list, which she also distrusts, like the list of things she likes and things she doesn't like about her husband. Like that's the writing project we know that she's engaged in, and that one is a disappointing one to her. One way to think about this is the question of like the role, motherhood as a role, and one of the things she seems to be both irritated by and impressed by about Andrew, who we can think of as maybe the husband slash ex-husband,
mhm.
is that she says, I would think how humble he was, really, taking on such a ready-made role of husband, father, breadwinner, and how I myself, in comparison, was really a secret monster of egotism. And I feel like in the world of the Bildungsroman, which is like the world that I live in, the 19th century novel, in which everyone is supposed to grow up to learn their role, learning how to inhabit the ready-made role of husband, father, breadwinner gets you a check. But in the Alice Munro story, I'm not sure that's really a check or a check plus. Like that's kind of a judgment of her husband as well as of course it's easy for him to fall into that role. Not so easy for me to fall into what's meant to be the complementary role.
Absolutely. I mean, in this story, as in many Munro stories, we see this disdain for and fear of becoming the figure of the typical mother, right? We see this description here. I had a dread of turning into a certain kind of mother, the kind whose body sagged and ripened, who moved in a woolly-smelling, milky-smelling fog, solemn with trivial burden. I believed that all the attention these mothers paid, their need to be burdened, was the cause of colic, bedwetting, asthma. And she tells us that she prefers to inhabit this other, more ironic and detached role, right? There's the great joke about the embryo Hitler, and she and her friends try to inhabit this world of wit and irony that is a little bit at odds with perhaps some of the constraints of motherhood, right? The attention that these mothers are paying is actually some attention that perhaps this narrator might need to pay to her own children, as we're going to see in the next part of the story.
Yeah, actually, Linda, can we connect that to that opening moment that when Steve's body is brought back, we're told that it's actually worse than it would be in a typical drowning because there is no mother to bring him home to. There's only a father. So there's that sense that Steve's drowning is somehow, it's not said explicitly, but it's somehow the result of there not being a female presence around, there only being male presences, and therefore, this is what happens. Kids drown.
Yeah, there isn't a woman around, so not only will this child not be properly grieved, but the accident itself might not have happened had there been a woman around, right? We hear that the mother just left under
Yeah.
various circumstances which are never explained to us, and that the fact that the child, Stephen, is still living with the father seems accidental, right? Wonderful
Yeah.
word accident there.
And it's pronounced, it's that phrase comes up twice, Linda. I was going to ask you about that repetition.
Yeah.
His fatherhood seemed accidental. They continued living together, seemed accidental. And then the word just recurs 3 times in the next sentence. just a bit better than a shack, just in time, just well enough. So she's not afraid of repeating herself.
No, not at all. Also, we might note here that this is a portrait of parenthood, which is, this parent is enacting fatherhood. He's doing just enough, right?
Yeah.
Everything's just held together by these supports that are put under the porch. There's just enough food. Everything is
Yeah.
sometimes. So there's just there's this sense that everything can fall apart if you're not quite careful, if you don't take the element of risk into account. And most of all, the fact that there is no mother present really puts this child at risk. And as a narrator, we have an interesting contradiction here, right? We have a narrator who wants to be free, again, of some of these demands of motherhood, who wants to hide away in her house and focus on her work, and who wants to shed, as she says, these different responsibilities.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, she implicitly has a little bit of judgment for this mother who has, in fact, abandoned her child.
Right. She says she likes being on a road trip because she can be a watcher rather than a keeper.
Mhm.
And the keepers are the people who are weighed down with trivial burdens. They're musty and moldy and they're woolly smelling. Is there something about their jumpers? Saggy bodies and woolly smelling. And yet, right, somehow she herself is kind of stuck in between those.
Right. And one thing that this story asks us to do is to think about, what is it exactly that the narrator is watching? Is she looking at the right things? Is she paying attention to
Yeah.
the right things? And she, again, has disdain for the attention that these other kinds of mothers, these bad smelling, dumpy,
Yeah.
sad, just put them out on the shelf mothers have. And she sees herself as viewing the world through a different lens, right? Of a more creative and artistic lens that may be, at some ways, at odds with this particular kind of traditional motherhood.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about one other thing, Linda, before we go on? Because I feel like it relates to the perversity or the failure to deliver closure that Munro works through with her stories. She remembers being really angry as a kid. She remembers this feeling of scratchiness of her stockings, and it's associated with this resentment that can't be understood against her parents. Is it resentment? Another feeling. Adults in general, but my parents in particular, a heaviness, a misgiving. That feels, and anger, and it's also called anger. What's going on with that? Like there's that, like the memory, of course, this guy died and it's incredibly sad. So there's sadness. There's the anger that she has when she thinks about him because he used to tease her. But then there's this other feeling of resentment or anger against adults.
Part of what's so interesting here is that she is fully identified with herself as a child and with the other in this scene, right? So she does not even yet, in the telling of this story, possess the maturity to narrate this event from the past from an adult perspective.
Yeah.
She's only really able to be present as a child. And this anger that she has and resentment towards the parents is very much from a child's point of view.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we started out by talking about the imperfection of her memory, the ways in which she knows that these things are just fabrications, they can't be true. But now you're describing something else, which is like the imperfection of just having your own perspective, like accurately remembering your feeling, but it's the feeling of it. It's either a childish or childlike feeling, like it's something that doesn't belong to your adult self. It's like it's nested in there like a Russian doll.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way of putting it. The other thing I want us just to quickly look at before we move on to the second part of the story is this wonderful moment where the narrator is again telling us about her sense of ironic detachment, how she wants to be like the women in the magazine stories. And she makes this completely tasteless joke. Is my embryo Hitler by any chance over at your house?
Mm-hmm.
And then immediately she shifts to, we saw a dead deer strapped across the front of a truck.
Yeah.
So she interrupts her irony with this image of death. And one thing that the reader has been anticipating all along, ever since we opened with this scene of a drowned boy, is this question, right? We've been anticipating and wondering, when are we going to see an image of death? When are we going to see something horrible happen? And she's kind of interrupting a moment in which she's joking, when she's being ironic, when she's being emotionally detached and intellectual, and she interrupts it with this image of death that she just puts right on the page. And
yeah, that's great. I mean, one thing that that I'm always delighted by in Munro is how she blends together sort of the body and the psychic life. So like, I love the description of Cynthia as having skin that shows the effects of sun, raw wind, pride, or humiliation. So in other words, that blushing or flushing or whatever is something that belongs to the body, because physically things happen to it, especially if you grow up on a farm, you're, susceptible to the physical world, but it's also a register of your inner life. And those things just get muddled together in the way that she associates the feeling of the stockings with this feeling of resentment or anger or humiliation towards parents. Like that's mixed up with the physicality of the stockings. Okay, that wraps up the first half of our reading from and reading of Alice Munro's Miles City, Montana. I won't thank you yet, Linda, because you and I will be back shortly to finish it off in part 2. So, dear listeners, don't go away. Just check your feed now to download Miles City, Montana, part 2 from Recall This Book. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.